I'm S.A. Bradley, and welcome to Hellbent for Horror, a podcast devoted to all things related to horror, where I remind you that you used to love horror movies, and you secretly still do. For me, the most important element in a horror movie is the element of surprise. When a horror movie flips the script on an old idea, it's like I have new eyes. And that is when horror movies work their magic. They take our fears and our real life anxieties, and they are transformed into a monster or a metaphor that we are able to confront with safety. Horror lets us talk about uncomfortable subjects in ways that dramas cannot. But horror needs that element of surprise to thrive. If it is not new, it is through. One of the reasons for the current horror resurgence is the inclusion and the success of diverse voices that tell stories from underrepresented perspectives. These artists celebrate people who don't often see themselves or their viewpoints or their anxieties realistically projected on the movie screen. And that's important because seeing yourself on screen and allowing your anxieties to be expressed can validate your life, your existence, and let you know you are not alone. These artists also flip the script so we can see their stories with new eyes. The excellent new documentary, Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror, is a love letter to the rich, powerful history of Black American artists in horror cinema. The story is told by the artists who made the movies, and they give their unflinching perspectives on the past, present, and future of Black horror. Horror Noir is a Shudder original production, and it is available now on Shudder streaming services. And my guests today are Dr. Robin Means Coleman and Tananarive Due, who are both executive producers of the film, as well as authors and educators. Dr. Coleman is currently the Vice President and Associate Provost for Diversity and a professor in the Department of Communication at Texas A&amp University. She has also written many books about media and the cultural politics of Blackness, including the book that is the source material for this documentary. And Tananarive Due is a filmmaker, author of 12 novels, and educator steeped in Black horror and Afrofuturism. Since 2007, she has been teaching a class at UCLA called The Sunken Place. Wow. Inspired by the movie Get Out, the class delves into the centuries-spanning history of Black horror. Tanana Reeve and Dr. Coleman, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having us.
I am super excited.
I'm super excited. It is so great to have lifelong horror fans on the show. So my first question is going to be about your first kiss with horror, that movie or the book that put you on this crazy path for the rest of your life. And Tanana Reeve, did I read that your mom was also a horror fan?
Yes, and I can't wait to hear Robin's story, but like a lot of Black horror fans I know, maybe this is just true of horror fans in general, but certainly of the Black horror fans I know, it's the moms who are bringing you the horror. My late mother was a civil rights activist and a very serious-minded person who wore some physical and emotional trauma from not just the civil rights era, but also watching the dismantling of those gangs over the years. So horror was her guilty pleasure, her release. I mean, we sat down and watched all those creature feature Saturday afternoon horror movies, like the old Universal, The Mummy and The Fly and all that. But the first one I remember that really scared me in the moment that I was like, oh, this feels bad, but this feels good, was the original version of The Fly, the 1958 version at the end when he's like, help me, in the spider web. And that just fed into all my fear of nothingness and mortality, and it's all meaningless. It's like, whoa, my head was spun.
That's so awesome. I love when people look at the end of something like The Fly, which normally gets, some laughs from people because it feels very B-movie. But I love that you got something from that idea of the nothingness that you would feel in that kind of spot. Do you remember who your horror host was?
Oh, wow. You know what? I don't. I can almost see a face. But it's going back a ways.
I still have my guy who was in northeastern Pennsylvania, Uncle Ted's Ghoul School. Oh my goodness, he was like the worst. So, Dr. Coleman, I think I probably know your first kiss because I have read your book, and the preface is quite poetic, but I'd love to hear all about it.
So first, please call me Robin. Dr. Coleman
Okay.
is completely unnecessary. And
Okay.
so I say I'm from Pittsburgh, so horror is in my DNA. I literally walked in the footsteps of George Romero, Night of the Living Dead, Tom Savini, who does the special effects, and Tanana Reeve is right. And I had not thought about this until this moment. The moms are all over this. It was perhaps for some stunningly inappropriate that I was in a drive in movie theater watching horror films when I was like 7. It's so funny now. But I will say, you said, who is your horror host? My mother and I, Patty Means, I have to say her name, we would lay across her bed. And at 10 o'clock at night in Pittsburgh, Bill Cardill, Chilly
Yes.
Billy,
Yes.
would come on. And from 10 p.m. until 2 a.m., we would eat chocolate cake and watch Chiller Theater. And I was so excited. Just this morning, his daughter, Lori Cardill, texted me and said, "Thank you for giving, my dad a shout out in the book." She has no idea how much that meant to me. Bill Cardill was everything to me.
Mm.
So he
Ooh.
was really good. And we loved his show.
That's wonderful. And of course, he has a cameo in Night, and his
Yes.
daughter Lori was a lead in
And
Day of the
Dawn,
Dead.
or was it Day? Oh,
Yeah,
Day
the
of the
third
Dead.
one.
Yes, right.
And so I love that. I also used to watch Zachary when he was, I think he might have been Roland at the time, but he was out of Philly. The East Coast, and especially in like that Rust Belt, Steel Belt kind of
That's
area,
right.
that was all about horror. So it's interesting you talk about Night of the Living Dead. That's probably, I vacillate between that movie being my number 2 of all time and my number 1 of all time. It really depends on how long it's been since I've seen it. It still has so much power to me. And it's one of those movies that, because it's done in a certain way, it is already kind of time capsuled in a way that makes it timeless. It's
What's your
got this
number
really,
2 of all time?
John Carpenter's The Thing.
Oh my gosh. We are so in
Hey,
agreement.
how did
I,
we go from our first kiss, which
yeah.
is mine was the B movie, The Fly, to like the best horror movies ever made? I'm
Well,
gonna say for the record that I'm well aware that The Fly, at least the original anyway, is not, worthy of any of these top
oh,
lists.
Oh, I don't I
don't let me.
No?
disagree.
Yeah, I was
Are
just
you
going to say,
Oh,
sure?
oh yeah.
I'm not here to
Really?
denigrate that at all. What I
Okay.
love is how these disparate things take us into a place where we fall in love and we are fascinated, and we take our passions and we move with that through our lives. And I love when it's idiosyncratic. It's almost like so many people say The Shining to me, and I'm like, oh God, The Shining again. I mean, I have my opinions, but at the same point, I'm like, I love when I hear Kolchak the Night Stalker. I watched
Oh,
Kolchak the Night
yes.
Stalker.
Yes.
Yeah, and people go, "Oh my gosh, yeah, I love that," because that's the kid, right? The kid is the one that fuels us. And then we smarten the kid, but the kid is the one that has pure love. And I think that first kisses do that. We find those pieces of those first kisses that hit us in a heart and soul level. And it doesn't matter whether Vincent Price had too much makeup on. It doesn't matter if the fake blood looks silly. It hits us in that spot, and it is ours for the rest of our lives. And I love, Robin, that you were in a drive-in watching Dawn of the Dead and Night of the Living Dead double feature.
Double
Was it
feature.
your mom and your grandmother, right?
That's right.
They are rock stars.
Yeah. Yeah. What stuck with me in that discussion that you have in the book is that your grandmother is watching the movie Night of the Living
Yes.
Dead, coming to the end, and she goes, "I recognize one of those gun-toting black man killing so-and-sos."
And she didn't say so and so.
I figured she probably didn't. But that hit me. We sit there and we watch these movies, and we forget that somewhere everybody's a local for whatever location is being shot. And that we're looking at this movie that is held up in high esteem. And it never even dawned on me that there might be someone of ill repute in that movie. being from Pennsylvania, knowing Pittsburgh a little bit, I was on the other side of the state, but knowing the type, when I saw these guys with their rifles and stuff, I said, they look pretty authentic. But I
And they
didn't
were.
really, yeah, it sounds like they might have been a
No,
little
not might have.
dangerous.
I mean, he really, Romero really does cast local police officers and members of the community who had been known to sort of form their own militia.
Wow.
And I believe it's Tony Todd in an interview when they do the remake, who talks about how difficult it is. It just repeats itself again. And he says that the racial tensions and the divisions on set were so difficult, and that there's a scene where I think that in the remake where the militia is to be beating on him, and he said that he took more than a few very real blows
Mm.
from those cast members who were community members, and it almost turned into a brawl. So this is, I mean, it's a fiction, but it also very much, really more than mirrors real life, but he's capturing on celluloid the race relationships of the time and today.
Yeah, I also love that you talk about Dawn of the Dead as well, which a lot of times it's only focused upon one piece of that film, and I'll get more into that. But one of the things that I thought was very powerful in Dawn was the moments where the militia is coming together, and there's like this old woman holding up coffee cups and swinging around, and the National Guard is there, and they're all
Mhm.
just hanging out. And that's always been chilling to me. He turns that into a little bit of a comedy. He's making fun, knowing that they think they're going to stop this thing, and they're having a good old time. And in a week, they're not going to be anymore. They're going to be gone because they
Right.
cannot hold back this tide. I don't know sometimes if Romero intentionally knew what he was getting, or if because he just got a bunch of locals together, he had these moments of frisson that was really freaky and talks on a different level. So as you can tell, I could probably go on forever about horror. I'm very much a geek about it, and it means a lot to me because when I was lonely as a kid, I had monsters in the movies, and that was pretty much it at certain points. So I wanted to ask both of you. Uh, we talked about your favorite films, but what does horror itself do for you personally?
I'd love to hear Tanana Reeve on this. I'm sitting here looking at, well, I went out and repurchased all of her books.
Oh my gosh.
Um, so I'm looking at a big stack because when we meet, I want her to sign all of them, and I didn't want her to sign worn out, dirty books. So,
Oh, I
um,
can't wait for that. I'm looking so forward to it. Well, and I get asked that question all the time as a creator, obviously. Why do you write this? At a time when there was a lot of an education process going on among my core readership, which was Black readers. And for me personally, I think it works the same way it does for a lot of horror fans, because I'm also a fan first, is that ability to visualize something that really scares me. I have, fears and anxieties like we all do, fear of mortality from a very young age, fear of nothingness. And so monsters and demons and zombies were my way of kind of leaching out those real life anxieties and making them sometimes fun, even scary. I could go through all these cycles of emotions, but then release it and expel it and just feel better, and also really looking for lessons in these survivors, especially heroines, in film and writing. I'm always trying to create those characters who are having their regular, ordinary lives. They have an encounter that turns their lives upside down. Like, I didn't even know there were demons yesterday, and now I have to fight one to get my son back. That it's like, where do people get that kind of strength? Because despite my childhood growing up in newly integrated neighborhoods where there were some tensions, and I was well aware of racial tensions as a child, I had a cushy childhood. I had my father and mother there. I had two sisters. We had a loving family. There was no abuse happening in our family. We were comfortable economically. I always felt so fortunate compared to so many other people I knew, especially Blacks, who were not as fortunate. So I was worried that when my trials came and my lessons came, I would be, that heroine who stumbles and falls rather than the ones I admire who, they may not win, but at least, damn it, they're going to be smart and they're going to be fast while they're trying to.
So you mentioned your books, and you have the African Immortals series. I think it starts with "My
Yes,
Soul to
yes.
Keep." And my wife, I just described them to her. She's like, "Okay, get them." So it just, I wrote a book, so I tend to look at Amazon reviews that people leave, and invariably, and it happens to me because I do a podcast and I talk about horror in a very broad fashion. Somebody invariably goes, "Well, that's good, but that's not horror." I'm going to tell you that it's not horror all the time. So I know, especially Robin, I think in your book, you explicitly talk about how hard it is to try and come up with a definition and that it's almost self-defeating. And I know, Tanana Reeve, I'm kind of like asking you to wrestle with smoke here, but would you like to try and...
Give me names. I just want names. No. Well, yeah. Is it horror? What is horror? This is a difficult question, and I had a horror scholar I admire once tell me. I think specifically he was talking about My Soul to Keep, and he said, "Oh, well, this isn't horror," and I was kind of hurt at the time, but I've walked it off because there are so many works that I consider horror that the authors have said is not horror, like Beloved by Toni Morrison. She doesn't go around calling herself the horror writer because she wrote Beloved. But to me, there's hardly a more frightening novel. And I think at the heart of it, that's just what my definition is. I know I wrote My Soul to Keep to be scary. I try to write, I write, they call it supernatural suspense, depending on what the fads are, to try to stay away from labels that make readers think about blood spattered walls or whatever. But for some horror readers, that is horror, blood spattered walls, and I just write about subjects that scare me with Black characters grappling with these things that scare them, writ large in some form that's not real to me, but will be real. Loss is real, so it won't come because of a demon, maybe, or because an immortal is trying to kill you. But we get lost, and that's the real horror, isn't it? So I think works that are sort of grappling around these issues of mortality, loss of one's own soul, whether metaphorically or literally, all of this stuff is the stuff of horror.
Well, I could go on this subject, but there's so much to discuss about horror noir, and it's really a wonderful, dense with information documentary. And there's so many people that are involved in Jordan Peele, Keith David, Ken Foray. We have the original director of Blackula, William Crane, which I was really overjoyed to see him because it's someone that I rarely ever see in any kind of interviews. Tony Todd's in there. But what's really intriguing are the subjects that are being talked about. So let's talk about a horror movie, since we just talked about people saying, "Oh, that's not horror, this is horror." A movie that some people don't call a horror movie, and that's Birth of a Nation. I saw it in film school on the big screen, and without a doubt, it's a horror movie. Let's talk a little bit about what, in fact, Robin, a lot of people might say, well, this is just a movie. This happened many decades ago. It's a time capsule. It's a historical document. What's the big deal? Can you give a little bit of context around why this movie was so damaging in the time that it came out?
So I really like what Tanana Reeve does in opening this movie when she says Black history is Black horror. It is, I felt like, okay, that's the beginning and the end of the documentary. That we don't need to do anything else. I will add that Richard Lawson's, "A Man Has Got to See His Face" is the other.
Yes.
Those are the two, I think, most powerful moments, quotes in the movie. And I think thinking about them together as you consider Birth of a Nation and what it does, and we talk about this in some detail in the film, was it meets the definition of horror. If you think about Isabel Pinedo's book, Recreational Terror, it is horrific in that it is disrupting our everyday world. And by our everyday world, I'm talking specifically about African Americans. It transgresses and violates our boundaries. It upsets any kind of valid notion of rationality. It evokes fear. It is the quintessential definition of horror. But most specifically is that it cannot be written off as merely fiction or merely representation, in that, as we talk about in the documentary, Woodrow Wilson himself says that this is how is it? It's like writing history with lightning or something to that
Mhm.
effect. And he does everything in his power to endorse this film. He does interviews where he is quoted about the power and the accuracy of the film. And as we talk about in horror noir, you see these images and these tropes repeat themselves again and again. This is a film about white supremacy and white superiority and the deficiency and the deviance of African Americans. It is a film about how Blacks, if the narrative is, if given power, if given freedom, if given their selves, they will be unable to handle that. It is completely a white savior film, and it is a Black inferiority film. And it isn't just that that film informed the nation. It is, in a lot of ways, a film that parts of this nation so desperately wanted. And that can only be the explanation for its continued power. It is not a film that has gone away these decades later. There are, dedications and film festivals, and we hear about the Klan and neo-Nazi groups who gift this film to members, and as a part of its recruitment. This is a film that is a stain on America, and that at the same time some Americans wanted.
So you mentioned some really interesting things there, and I will say about the horror movie aspect of it. It does hit the definition of horror as far as I'm concerned. It has a horror movie universe. Everything must be wrong. Everything has to go wrong so that there's only one answer. So we have to see an entire system that doesn't work. Everything has to fall apart. Every fear that you have has to be realized. And I think the same thing is being done, certainly in Birth of a Nation. I mean, the thing that always, when I was watching it, I was going, photography, all this stuff. I mean, it's really an exciting film at certain points, but you can feel almost from the very beginning of the movie that you're being skewed and pushed in one direction. And that direction is very unsubtle. The thing that always really hit me hard was when they show the black legislation, when they're in
Mm.
the state legislation. And it's just like, what was he saying? It's heartbreaking to watch. It's really disgusting. And then we find two people who are kind of like the response to that. So I wanted to talk about two filmmakers who made their own films on their own terms. That'd be Oscar Micheaux and Spencer Williams. So I studied Oscar Micheaux in film school, really interesting guy. But in film school, not once was it alluded to that he ever made anything remotely like a horror movie. But it sounds like he made a few. Robin, was Son of Satan one of them?
Son of Satan was one of them. And I think what is important about Michaud is, again, that these are more thriller type horror films that have a particular morality tale or morality narrative that defines them. And in the film, we talk a little bit about that. And what may not have been as clear, that I'd like to clear up now, is that these morality tales are in response to narratives of, again, Black deficiency. So in a lot of ways, Michaud is a quote unquote race man who is deeply concerned about Black respectability. And he's using his films to show what a sort of upright, generally middle class African American looks like, but also the kinds of behaviors that African Americans should reject, should walk away from. And if you are someone who does engage in these behaviors, then Michaud says, a different life choice or life outcome is coming your way, and it's going to be at the crossroads. And I think that's the power of Michaud that certainly sets up Spencer Williams. But I see Tanana Reeve, because we can see each other a little bit, and she's
Oh,
nodding, and I want to make sure she gets in here
I'm
and
just
is able
loving
to
this.
reflect on Michelle.
Well, I'm just loving listening to you, but it really, I'm nodding along because it just reminds me of these sort of turn of the century and Reconstruction era leaders I've written about, like Madam C.J. Walker and Scott
Yes.
Joplin. And it was
Yes.
the era of Booker T. Washington, no matter how people felt about him. But I really do believe that this generation, and Michelle is not that far removed, felt like they were the first steps after slavery. They're not that far removed from those formerly enslaved people who raised them. And there was really this idea of not just helping people conduct good lives and succeed, but this very naive notion that if we just dress right and behave correctly, there will be this massive acceptance of us despite the race barrier. And it was too early to see how, even despite all of that, racism would continue to linger. And in part because of that national narrative that was being written in The Birth of a Nation. I mean, yeah, it came out in 1915, but like Robin said in her book, it reigned as the box office hit until Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. I mean, that's a long time.
Yeah.
And for unsophisticated moviegoers, damn it, that it's so innovative and well made and all that,
Right.
because it looks like documentary footage, honestly. The Civil War and the legislative footage. It's just so maddening, because I was just researching that era. And in Louisiana, for example, during Reconstruction, this new Black leadership was working to get free public schools for everyone. All this sort of
Mhm.
progressive innovation that would have benefited everyone. You can't make laws just to benefit Black people, at least certainly not for the most part. So, yeah, that it was twisted that way, and that we're still fighting those same battles. The battles to take down the Confederate statues is the same damn because that's the same damn propaganda era that gave birth to this film. And it's just maddening to watch it coming back into fashion.
So I think I had read that Michaud's movie Within Our Gates was a direct response to Birth of a Nation. Is that true? It was like his attempt to even out
That's
the
right.
weird
Yeah,
disparity.
absolutely. And so, yes, Michelle does that, but there was something that Tanana Reeve talks about um, when she's writing about Madam C.J. Walker, and I just wanted to kind of highlight this point, is that there is a lot in popular culture history and media history where Blacks are responding to white narratives that set Blacks up as less than or other. But what Tananarive does in talking about Madam C.J. Walker is also to remind, which is, I'm going to connect this to horror, which is what Black horror does versus Blacks in horror, which is
Right.
to remind that there are powerful narratives that come out of Blackness, that there is a powerful history that comes out of Blackness, and that it need not always be set up in contrast to whiteness, because within Blackness, there are these incredible lived experiences and stories to be told. She does that with her work around Madam C.J. Walker, and I think we certainly know she does that with her books. And we see that in the genre and the horror genre as well, where at some point African Americans are saying, you know what, you're good over there. You do, sort of your white productions over here, but Black folks have a history and story to tell, and our outcomes and our narratives of these the outcomes of these narratives are going to be different, and they're going to be for us, and they're going to be by us.
That's great. And I love you brought that point up, Robin, about the richness of the storytelling that is not always oppositional, in terms of race, which is a question that comes up as we look ahead to the future of Black horror. I love Tales from the Hood by Rusty Cundiff and what he does in that film to confront
Mhm.
racism as the monster with magic as a remedy. I love, love, love what Jordan Peele did with Get Out. Don't get me started. I think that's a fantastic film. I'll watch it a million times. But also now, when you look at an overall Black horror aesthetic and what that means, I think it would be a mistake for any of us as creators and certainly as executives to feel limited by this notion that in order for a horror film to have Black characters, it must be somehow about race and social justice. Because, we spend most of our time being human.
That's right.
And those stories resonate deeply with us when we see ourselves on the screen. And we deserve to see all of those stories about internal conflicts, external conflicts that are not racial, just all of those stories. And the fact that the characters are Black, that's still revolutionary, whether or not we're talking about race.
There's a really good example of what Tanana Reeve is talking about. And Eric LaSalle has this horror movie I've worked to talk about a lot. It's called Crazy as Hell. It stars Michael Beach, and it is simply about the human condition. Michael Beach is dealing with the death of his daughter and trying to keep his marriage together. And he is also sort of really overworked. And it is a story that just speaks so broadly to the things that are going on every day in our lives. And it has Black history in it, Black narratives, and it comes from within Blackness. And it's one of the films that I'm most proud of. It doesn't have a social justice piece, although those are fine as well. But sometimes we have everyday experiences just like everybody else. And that's one of the films I'm proud of. And so I really appreciate her point.
That's
and
great.
I appreciate your point.
Have either of you seen the Transfiguration? A really low budget film that was out. I think it was shot in Coney Island, and it follows an African American boy who believes that he's a vampire. So it's like Martin. And it is one of the most subtle horror films I've seen in a long, long time. It's just basically, if you remember George Romero's Martin, it was showing Pittsburgh kind of like a casket, a dying place. And so you have that for Coney Island, and this boy who is living with his brother who is back from the Gulf War. He has PTSD. He basically just sits on the couch. Mom committed suicide in the bedroom. They just have that door closed. So it's almost as if he's living in casket after casket after casket.
And
what
he may or
does,
may not be a vampire.
yeah, he is obsessed with vampire movies, and he spends his
All
time
right, I'm
talking
taking
to
notes.
it's a really, really good movie. And it just talks to a loss of neighborhood, a loss of home, and loss of family. And that whether you're supernatural or not, some people might be vampires. Some people might be zombies, even though it's they're not dead, they're spiritually gone. And so I thought that was, and Ganjan Hess, I kind of feel, has a little bit of that as well. That's a really interesting film because yes, there's the idea of blood in there, and I believe vampirism, but there's this whole weird thing of losing, almost like a nervous breakdown that's slowly happening all the time for Hess. He's made it to this point, but he's not really. Both he and the man who comes to live with him for a little bit there, both have kind of the same kind of, I don't know if we would call it neurosis. They're living a life, and I don't know if they feel they should be living that life. Really, really intriguing stuff. So I love when horror movies aren't overt. You have this, obviously there are horror elements to Ganjan Hess, but it's really about internal horror and externally how that shows itself to other people. So anyway, before I get too far off, we gave a lot of love there to Oscar. I didn't want to leave Spencer Williams out hanging. And I think it's really interesting. You were talking earlier, Robin, about how there's was the white narrative and there was the Black narrative. I don't know if you could hit it more on the nose than with Son of Ngagi, where you have this movie that was made before, and then Spencer Williams makes kind of the sequel. So Tanana Reeve, you talked about that in the movie. Can you speak a little bit about the weird origin story of Son of Ngagi?
Well, a lot of this I learned from Robin's book, but I will say, after having taught it and seen it a few times, this idea of taking a popular film, Ngagi, which had been, hugely successful, purporting African women were mating with gorilla-like creatures, etc., that was widely debunked. He kind of had his cake and ate it too, taking the title Son of Ngagi. So I guess you can sort of draw on the popularity of this very offensive premised film, but also then turn it on its head and remake it. And you still do kind of have that half man, half gorilla creature in the basement, but so many other things that are exciting about Son of Ngagi. In fact, I just did my midterm for my UCLA exam, and I have a question about Son of Ngagi where, like, what's the most significant thing about the film of these things? Not just that it's horror, and it's that, I think, depiction of middle-class Black life for me, or at least that's the way, well, the way the questions are written, that's the obvious answer if you watched it or heard my lecture. It's not the state-of-the-art special effects, which is one of the answers. And I forget what the other answers were, but yes, this wedding ceremony, and especially when you contrast that to Birth of a Nation, which was earlier, but not that much earlier, in terms of a depiction of Black life, period. And the detective, and like Robin said in the documentary, women in STEM. There's Black women in STEM, so everyone is articulate and intelligent, and there's a little bit of comic relief, but none of it is as over the top as what you would see in comparable white produced horror films with bug-eyed, childish Black actors. So yeah, that Son of Ngagi, and I love that it happens to be horror too. That's great.
Well, I knew nothing of Spencer Williams, I have to say, except for, an allusion to Amos and Andy. So it was really interesting how he was talked about here. And it seemed like he might have been doing a little bit of satire as well as rebuttals and rebukes with Son of Ngagi. But you also mentioned that he made a huge impact in Black film history, in basically creating what we now know as Black cinema. Can you go into that a little bit? That was a really interesting and provocative statement.
Well,
for
I'll let
someone that I didn't
Robin
know.
take that. So I know Robin spoke so well about that in Horror Noir.
So what's exciting about Spencer Williams is that what's interesting about Spencer Williams, I will say, is that his films were lost for a number of years. They were discovered in a storage locker of all things, and he has quite a large kind of portfolio of films that are not all horror. Some of them are, some of them aren't. And almost all of them are morality tales, which is really interesting. Williams is a really accomplished director. He has a long history of being involved in entertainment, both working kind of behind the curtain. He has roots in theater, and then he goes in front of the camera to do films like The Blood of Jesus. So he is also a particularly race conscious director, but is directing from within Blackness as well. So you will see, I actually am struggling to think if you see a white character at all, or even a non-Black character in his films, and maybe they are passing through. But these are stories very much for African Americans. In a lot of ways, and people debate the quality of Tyler Perry's films, but Tyler Perry owes his existence to Spencer Williams. The kinds of religious and morality tales that Perry offers up come out of Spencer Williams' tradition. And in a lot of ways, I think Spencer Williams does it better. Williams even includes in some of his films short clips of real life preachers and gospel choirs and baptismals. All of that is happening in a real high quality way. So I know people talk a lot about Michaud, rightly so, but the very next generation is Williams. And if you watch his films, you will see his fingerprints, his impact on so many African American filmmakers, and frankly, not just African American, but filmmakers, period, because of the kinds of stories. He starts with stories that he's telling.
So that's what I thought was really fascinating about horror noir. There were a lot of things that I didn't know about that were brought to my attention. Something like that, Spencer Williams, someone who was kind of lost to film history, being revived in that way was great. And there are several times in the documentary where what I realize is how unobservant I can be. I think I see things, but my perception is in one direction, and I need to hear other people discuss this for me to notice. So, one of the biggest ones was invisibility. So, I wanted to talk about invisibility in the movies because in the 30s and 40s, there's only certain niche roles that African Americans could have. And even though I knew that I didn't see any black faces in the 50s, I've never put two and two together as to why that happened. So could you talk a little bit about this moment that happened where it just went in, black faces went away for a while in films?
Okay, so
Jump in on that, Robin.
the book itself is written kind of by decade. And so the 30s are marked by jungle films, apes, and obsession with those kinds of movies. The 1940s I describe it as a kind of comedy era. Mantan Moreland, Sleep and Eat are popular in horror films. The 50s and 60s is what I call the science and invisibility era. And as we talked about in the film, Blacks were secondary characters in Blacks in horror films. They were sidekicks, they were comic relief, particularly coming out of the 40s into the 50s. And filmmakers in the 50s, white filmmakers in the 50s, just could not imagine Blacks having a place or a space in things like laboratories or, on rocket ships and these kinds of things. And so they were written out. They were rendered invisible because Blacks and technology were not understood as being two things that could go together. Tanana Reeve, I don't know. What did you think about the 50s?
I was about to do some quick research to see what year the Mole People came out. Because I don't know offhand, but it feels like a film from the 50s, even if it's not one. Because, and you mentioned this in the documentary and probably also in the book, where I think as a kid, and this is one of the ones I remember from Creature Features, that I might have sort of vibed to the idea that the Mole People represented the subjugated on one level.
Mm-hmm.
I did not necessarily associate them with me. I didn't take it that far, but now with analysis, like, oh yes. And I do think that sort of metaphorical rendering science fiction and horror films, but thinking of science fiction too, really gives itself a lot of pats on the back for being forward thinking in that era. While at the same time, it's so not. It's so retro. Even when you look at the roles for women, they couldn't have the imagination that the women would be doing much more than serving the coffee when we are supposed to be colonizing Mars.
Right.
But we can't see past gender roles. So never mind. Black folks were not going to have a chance to get on that rocket or whatever it was. But at the same time, metaphorically feeling like you're uplifting the stories of the downtrodden, while at the same time you're keeping them down. It's an interesting time.
But do you, I wonder if it's okay if I ask a question. One of the things we talk about in the film, Tananarive, is how the monsters are metaphors for Blackness. And
Right.
I wonder if we were clear enough in the film about that. And so
I think so.
I jump in and say, yep, absolutely. King Kong, Creature from the Black Lagoon are these metaphors. But what did you think of that argument?
I loved it. And I read it in your book and I was like, yes. This was the conversation I always pictured with you, Robin, except there was no host in the conversation. No offense to the host. But I absolutely, and that's one of those things where people, will sometimes get pushback and say, oh, I don't see it, but I totally see it. I mean, especially if you look at it in the context of Gus and Whiteface from Birth of a Nation to King Kong and then to Candyman. It is always the seeking of the white woman. This is like such a strong narrative beat, in our history and in the fabric of our history. So I didn't see it. As a kid, I didn't see it. Planet of the Apes, kind of, as a kid, I was like, this feels sort of like the underclass rebelling, and maybe I'm supposed to be the ape. But
right, and then they explicitly draw the connection when they ask the brother, and the brother's like, as a descendant of slaves, and I'm like, oh, okay, well,
but Dan and gone pretty quickly, I might point out. Um, so yes, this idea of the black man as the monster is something that I think Jordan Peele is able to turn on its head and Get Out, because he's creating more of the version of the Guess Who's Coming to Dinner black man, who is impeccable in his manner and so nice and has a very tragic backstory. So he is the opposite of that monstrous black man that we get in Candyman and that we get metaphorically through all these other films. And that's, just one of the ways that Jordan Peele was pushing back at some of these tropes, because typically speaking, the black man in the house is the threat. Typically speaking, it's the white neighbors peering out of the window at Andre, the black man walking through their neighborhood, feeling, oh my gosh, should I call the police? So he's flipped the whole story through the black lens, which is why it's so, so important. And I've said this before, if horror noir does nothing, the adaptation, I love the idea that all these artists that we're talking about are getting light now after so many years of being either lost in storage facilities or stashed away at the Museum of Modern Art, like Ganjan Hess, or people like, oh yeah, I haven't seen that movie in 20 years, like all these filmmakers getting their due. But if it can help future filmmakers, current people who are in meetings right now, avoid some of these tropes, I will feel like that work has been done with this, because Hollywood has a short memory. There's a lot of turnover, a lot of young people coming in who haven't even seen Candyman. It's not even really streaming widely right now. So are they going to make the same mistakes because they're honestly still breathing the same air that was wafted out back in Birth of a Nation, which was literally the birth of modern Hollywood? It's like breathing that same air. It's like, I don't know that many black people, so I'm drawing on films I've seen before, stereotypes I've heard, ways I think they speak. I don't know what their personal lives are like, so they're not going to have a family and all the other characters will. They're going to sacrifice themselves to save you, and that makes me feel like you're noble, like the good servant in Birth of a Nation. It's like, what? And it's, believe me, there are meetings right now where people are discussing these tropes and there are not enough Black people at the table. One is not enough to push back and help avoid repeating history.
There are two things, I think, and they're interrelated. And the first is because the Oscars were on just recently, and I was reflecting on that. And people, Get Out is amazing, right? It's an amazing film, as Tanana Reeve said, and it becomes sort of iconic as a horror film because it joins Rosemary's Baby, Silence of the Lambs as being exalted, but exalted by mainstream cinema, by Hollywood. And we think about that as being the pinnacle of achievement. I guess I want to make clear that Get Out would have been amazing without that particular kudos. And the reason I think it's important to say that is because Get Out is a powerful story, and there are literally hundreds of other really powerful horror stories out there that will never, get a nomination, but those stories are worthy. They're worth being seen. They're worth being told. And if there's anything I want to say about the future of this genre, is that I hope that people continue to make them and write those powerful stories. Digital media affords people access in ways that we have not seen to be able to get out there and record, to film these stories. Even if it's on their iPhone, you can do amazing things with this technology. So I hope it produces more and opens more doors, and for people to know that it's okay. It doesn't always have to, that you don't always have to have Hollywood recognition for fans, true fans of the genre, to say that your stories are valuable and that they're important.
Here, here. I salute that flag. That was perfect.
Good point.
So I wanted to, because we're at this point now, we've talked a little bit about Jordan Peele. Let's go right in there. I wanted to talk about something Jordan Peele brought up called the Black fear of white spaces. So can you give a little bit of a description of what that is? Because there were a couple of moments in the documentary where people said things like, he's giving away our secrets, stuff like that, and jokes. So let's talk about that. It's a very interesting play on words.
Well, especially in the post integration era, where you don't have blacks, you're the lawyer and the wino all living in the same neighborhoods. We are scattered. I think that's why we over-index in our use of social media. We're trying to drum and find each other across the miles. You're the only one in the workplace. You were the only one sometimes in the classroom. When my parents first moved us to a newly integrated neighborhood when I was about 10 years old, and I wore glasses, and I had even 5-year-old kids calling me the N-word, teenager calling me the N-word, I realized that I was walking with my eyes to the sidewalk. Like, I would not look ahead or to the side. I was staring down at the ground. And I was doing that to try to be invisible to people, not to be noticed, not to become a target. And I checked myself when I realized I was doing it. But it was this feeling, and there were people making death threats. My parents never told us, but there were white church members. They were at a Unitarian church who would sit out and guard our house. And even if your parents don't tell you, there's this undercurrent of hostility and danger. And that may be my most acute memory of it in a sustained way. Like, this is where I was living. But on some level, that isolation kicks in when you're at a Hollywood party, when you're at your publishers, when you're visiting a network office and you look at all the faces. It's just like, wow, there are so many beaches that we have not yet set foot on, even now in 2019. And usually it can lead to some microaggressions and some misunderstandings at best. But at worst, your teenage son has been shot dead because he scared a cop because he was a black kid.
I have to say, the very beginning of Get Out was when I knew this was going to be a tremendous film, because the beginning is so scary. And it's not what I wasn't sure what to expect. Jordan Peele, I love his work, and I could tell just by some of the comedy bits that he did that he's a horror fan, and he's got a great geekiness to him. But the idea that there was no spooky music, there wasn't an overdoing of camera angles, it felt almost documentary like. And that there was a lilt of tension, nervous humor in that opening sequence really just drew me right into the screen. And it's not lost on me that Get Out is released 50 years after Night of the Living Dead came out, because I think that Get Out is the Night of the Living Dead of this time period. It's the movie that needed to happen, kind of like what Night of the Living Dead was. Romero said that Night was about revolution, and he always said that the zombies were the old regime being eaten by the new, or the new regime is eating the old. And I think that if there's one thing I would say about Get Out, it eats old ideas for breakfast. That movie just goes from one trope to another and turns it on its head. And I think, Robin, you mentioned being very tense before you saw Get Out because you were worried if Jordan Peele was going to get it right. And can you talk about what there was that was so important for him, that you had seen done wrong so often, that you were just like, yes, this is how this is going to work?
So you're coming off of the 1990s and that era of horror films. Blacks are in the urban spaces in the 90s. So, there's like Children of the Corn Urban Harvest. There's what is it? Leprechaun in the Hood. Like, that's what we're coming off of. And you worry, like, who's going to be his horror influences? What is he going to pick up? In some ways, horror builds, or all media builds on each other, right? And so you're like, I hope he's not building on the 90s. What I love about what he does, and this is about space, and Tanana Reeve talked about the fear of white spaces. I wrote a piece about space and place in Get Out that appears in Dawn Keatley's her forthcoming book on horror. And I talk about how Get Out, what it does so well is that it recuperates Black space. It recuperates Black home. And so the horror, for a change, for Black folks is in the white suburbs. Up until Get Out, the horrific space had always been Black spaces. So if you were in the suburbs and it's a white suburb, then it still couldn't be whiteness that made the suburb horrific. It had to be Black people or brown people, Indian burial grounds was a popular way to infect white spaces as horrific. And then you had the urban spaces who were horrific and needed to be cleaned and cleansed of Black folks. Get Out finally does something that those two approaches to space don't do, which is to say something horrific can come out of whiteness, can come out of the suburbs, and that the Black urban in particular is to be valued. It is home, it is community, it is love, and it connects right back to what Tanana Reeve was talking about with Son of Ngagi, where you see a Black wedding for the first time. You see Black love in the urban in Get Out. And so you think, well, this movie is set in the suburbs. Where's their love in the Black urban? And everything is about Rel's character. What's his
Rod.
Rod, right. Rod is at home. He's taking care of his apartment. He's kind of in Black home. They know the folks who have gone missing. And at first I thought, ooh, this is going to be bad because it seems like all Black people know each other. But then it was like, no, Black Brooklyn is a community. And we live together, we worship together, we go to clubs together, we protect each other. And I think that is so important about Get Out. And if you also remember his character, when his mom is killed and he says, she wasn't home. She didn't come home. And I knew something was wrong because she wasn't home. That's the power of Get Out, is that safety for once was in Black home. And I love that.
Tanana Reeve, I've been waiting to hear you discuss A Sunken Place all this time because I'm really intrigued by the fact that you have this class on. Now, I don't want you to give away the meat of your class that you teach on The Sunken Place, but can you give us your thoughts on this cinematic device and metaphor, which I think is just truly profound?
Okay, well, the class is called The Sunken Place, Racism, Survival, and the Black Horror Aesthetic. So I'm using The Sunken Place as an umbrella term for an overview class, about the elements of Black horror that I think run somewhat parallel to what Jordan Peele is doing in Get Out, which is to sort of visualize the thing itself and try to, like, racism as the monster to get to the thing itself. So The Sunken Place conceptually, some of your listeners may have heard that Jordan Peele actually came to my class. I was tweeting about it, as I often do. I'm a big tweeter, and through Monkey Paw, set it up. I got a DM from Jordan Peele himself the day he heard I was teaching this class. And so he wanted to come and surprise the students, which he did, and it was fantastic. It was just an epic moment because I had the lights down. I was showing that scene in Get Out that everybody hates so much when Rose reveals herself as the false ally that she is and says, you're not getting these keys, babe. And we know he is by himself. They're talking to the screen. Everyone's mad. So I turned up the lights. Jordan Peele had snuck in earlier wearing a baseball cap and a hoodie. And I said, who wants to talk about what you think the director was trying to say about the coveting of Black bodies? And he raised his hands and got up and they went crazy. And I like to say not because, he's Jordan Peele celebrity, but because it was, he's Jordan Peele, this master artist who created this film, Get Out, that we'd spent 3 weeks working up to, going through everything from Birth of a Nation to The Comet by W.E.B. Du Bois that has a Black man and white woman as survivors and just, all the prepping. So he talked about The Sunken Place in class as what he said was, he'd come to the 20-minute mark. He knew he had to bring a scare. This is a horror movie. And the concept of The Sunken Place came to him. And as he was writing it, what he was thinking about specifically, he said, was mass incarceration and all of these Black bodies being thrown down into holes. And he said, while he was writing it, he started crying. But that is not to say that that is all that The Sunken Place is about. There are other ways that the term is interpreted. It's, as he said, it's both internal and external subjugation. So it's Ben Carson, who is, a Black person in the Trump administration giving cover to policies that are actually damaging to Blacks and other minorities. That's considered The Sunken Place. This sort of, you're an accessory to white supremacy. But there's also the sunken place in the NFL, trying to restrict the freedom of football players who it's perfectly fine for them to entertain you and bruise their bodies, but don't let them have a thought. Don't let them kneel. It's the most ridiculous thing. But and there are so many ways, talk about Get Out meeting its time. It was perfect for me in terms of the class because I could use this as a way to teach about the history of Black horror in cinema and literature. And people will get it now that there's this thing called Black horror because this movie and this concept of the sunken place is so revolutionary. But it was also this perfect moment of release right after the election of President Trump, where people were having questions about allyship, looking at these voting statistics and, some assumptions that they had about what percentage of people would be with you. And the sunken place was a great term for kind of where we were finding ourselves nationally, having to confront some false ideas about who we are, the lie of being in a post-racial society that so many people were so self-satisfied about the previous 8 years, and Get Out really is also all about that. Look out for that monster you can't see, right? So that was the era that birthed it, was the more placid Obama, yeah, really? Are we really post-racial? Trayvon Martin and Black Lives Matter would say otherwise. So yeah, it really is a perfect concept for its time, as well as a film for its time. And, you said you fell in love with Get Out when you saw Andre walking down the street at the opening. I liked Get Out. I was very happy with where it was going, but I was just under a spell. I was like Chris sitting in the chair with Missy in the teacup when she was hypnotizing him and me while I watched this film take this left turn into the fantasy space in a way that, oh, okay, this movie is about something. This is really this is not just that trailer had some cute moments and that's all you're going to get. Right. The trailer was just the beginning of where Get Out was, and it was watching Chris in that hole, voiceless, helpless. That is horrifying. And every time I watch that moment of the induction, I'm newly horrified.
Yeah, that's truly amazing. And that's, when I talk about it being Night of the Living Dead, I look at what it revolutionized in its own way. And the one thing that, you look at Romero, he took something like the zombie, which was kind of a weird character that wasn't very scary in movies, and he turned it into this metaphor. And he turned it into something frightening that has just gotten stronger over the years. And what I think is really interesting about Get Out is that it changes the face of how cinematically we look at what racists are going to look like. So you have this whole thing of where we've been conditioned that he's going to be loud, he's going to be bored, he's going to say all this stuff, when it ends up being the quote unquote well-meaning progressive that has a lot of money and is basically saying all this. When I saw the sunken place, I felt that it was this thing of your allies are no longer your allies. Your allies are giving you lip service. So you come for help and they basically say, shut up. And put you in this pause. You're in pause, just kind of floating, waiting for who's going to actually talk to me. And I thought that was very uncomfortable for a lot of people. And I thought that was what was great about it, because horror is supposed to make you uncomfortable. It's supposed to give you those stingers. And so I felt that was probably, with all of the things that were in there, that was the one that I felt was he's found his zombie. He's found his way to turn this into something that is going to be big. Obviously, I could go on forever about this stuff. I almost feel like I have to have you guys on or come up with an internet cafe where we can talk about the metaphors of these movies and the different perceptions that we have at different spots in it. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about a post-Get Out era of Black horror filmmaking. When we were looking at the documentary, we go through blaxploitation, and in that there's a certain respect for it, but at every point, I think everybody says, well, this movie's problematic. This movie's problematic. There are problems in those. And so at one point, what blaxploitation was doing was seemingly a step forward where there wasn't a step before. But as time goes by, opportunities get better, things change, the social structure changes. It's now problematic and maybe not at that thing. So I guess after Get Out, this post Get Out, what's the problematic thing right now in film that once was useful, but now needs to go away? Is there anything that you go, that should go?
That once was useful.
The blaxploitation
Yeah,
era.
maybe it was never useful.
Yeah. The blaxploitation era is interesting because, for the most part, what we're talking about is representation, and the narrative that runs through that is it comes off of a period of invisibility, and then invisibility returns in the 80s for the most part. So that 70s decade is where you see that representation matters, that representation is important. And I don't believe we're there yet in a kind of post representation moment. And very specifically in mentioning things like the Academy Awards, where we are celebrating that there is diversity in these awards. I appreciate that. And at the same time, I don't think we're in a post representation period just yet. And by that, I mean that we are starting to see more faces on the big screen. We're starting to see some of these roles be recognized. We can't forget what kinds of roles are being recognized, what the narratives are that are being celebrated, whether they come from within Blackness and the imagination of African Americans, or if they serve another purpose, which is still to sort of bolster and hold up, in this case, whiteness, in some cases, even white supremacy that is being rewarded. So the thing that I think will continue is a focus on representation. Going forward, it's going to be what kinds of representation we see.
Yes.
What we leave behind is going to be some of the sexism. You know, JD's Revenge was what had promised to be a really good horror film, but it went into this deep tailspin of just horrific misogyny in the middle of it. So I think we're going to leave that behind. I think we're going to leave behind an exclusion of women. Women are now emerging as the horror heroes and sometimes the horror anti-heroes. So I think that's what the future of horror is, but we are not done with discussions of representation.
And just to
what do you think?
Yeah, just to piggyback on what you were saying, and I'm still raw from the Oscars. I'm not going to get into it, representation is key. It is true that there are scripts being changed to make characters Black who originally were not Black, to try to capitalize on, as Peele writes in Get Out, Black is in, on the passage. There's a very brilliant young actress, Black child actress carrying that series, and she was not Black in the books. And I'd love to know what made that come about. So far, so good. So far, like Robin said, we don't see the sexism. We do see good roles for Black women and Black men. But representation is not going to be enough, because inevitably what will happen is that people who, sometimes Black creators, who have long alliances, as you must have had to have had a measure of success for the most part in Hollywood with white producers and directors and writers, will create alliances with works that have Black faces. Some of those works will be horror, but will they be Black horror, or will they be, as Robin writes in her book, Blacks in horror? So Blacks in horror is the white faces, the Black faces, but not a Black story, not through a Black lens. Black horror is through a Black lens, and it is a Black story, and the Black character has the agency. So that's the battle that will continue. It's sort of a mixed bag, as there is more of a greater understanding that Black folks have a multi-generational love for horror. As you can see in the documentary Horror Noir and here in this conversation, people who try to capitalize on that are going to make missteps and are going to insult us.
Wow, she just preached a word, didn't she?
They will. I can see it coming on the horizon already.
Yes.
It's happened before, right? So We have just scratched the surface of what is encompassing Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror, a new documentary out of Shudder, talking about movies from Candyman to Tales from the Hood to Eve's Bayou. There are many films that we haven't discussed here. Hopefully you've been able to get a little bit of a taste of some of the style that's there and the stories that are coming up and the conversations that can be had. There's a lot of really intriguing things that I haven't even gotten near. But we're at that point. So Tanana Reeve and Dr. Coleman, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show. Can you give us, the listeners, some additional information about the documentary and any other events or projects that you're involved with right now?
Well, I'll start. The documentary is streaming on Shudder, and the people who say they don't have Shudder, they do have a free 7-day trial. There might even be a 30-day trial out there, so don't let that stop you. I also, because my Sunken Place class at UCLA got so much publicity, I started offering an online version of it that anybody can take. It's not affiliated with UCLA. I teach it with my husband, Stephen Barnes, at www.sunkenplaceclass.com.
Brilliant. I can't beat that, except that I'm going to take the class.
No, I'm going to send you a link to the class.
And I want to congratulate both of you because I've heard that Horror Noir is now the most streamed documentary on Shudder. I believe it's #1 at this point. So that's great. It's only been around since February 7th, and it seems to be just gaining momentum. And I want to thank everyone who is listening for taking the time to do so. And feel free to email me with your own thoughts about today's episode. Tanana Reeve, Robin, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
And thanks for listening to the show. Hellbent for Horror was written and broadcast by me, S.A. Bradley, and produced by me and Lisa Gorski. You can find more on our website, hellbentforhorror.com, and I'm also on Facebook at facebook.com/hellbentforhorror, and my Twitter handle is hellbenthorror. Please hit that subscribe button to get H4H hot off the press. And if you can do a review on iTunes or whatever app you listen to us on, that really helps people get to find us. And now for some Hellbent for Horror news. The podcast is available on some more outlets now, so you can listen to H4H on Spotify, iHeartRadio, and TuneIn Radio, as well as the regular iTunes, Android, and Amazon apps. And let there be swag. H4H t-shirts are now on sale. We have a store on tpublic.com with a bunch of Hellbent for Horror designs, and you can have your choice of t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, coffee mugs, something horrible beautiful for you or that someone special. The link to the merchandise store is on our website, hellbentforhorror.com. And until we meet again, stay hellbent.